we've got a brilliant speaker tonight, high-end speaker. You must show the respect that's due by giving him the 1 hour. He wants to fill your brains with information. That is why we're here. We are not affiliated. We do not belong to anything. Just listen, learn, throw it away, do what you want with it. But it's important to understand that, as I said, we have to give the respect to the speaker and let him give his message. After the break, there'll be a short interlude. Roger's going to say something on behalf of the three-man application he's making, and then we'll have some questions and probably another half an hour of chat and questions. We'll pay by here. There's no rules. Also, as I said, if we can appreciate with the landlady, she does like us all to be out by about 20 past 11. So last week I got a bit of a turning out for the quarter to 12. So I'm going to introduce Tony Gosling. It's my great thanks that he's here. Tony Gosling, everybody.
Right, thank you, Andy. Now, just to tell you a bit about my background, kind of worked for a few years after school, did a humanities degree, worked for a few years after that in the family business, which is in aviation. And I think one of the, I suppose, 2 or 3 years working on an airfield in Biggin Hill, in just near South East London. It's one of those things that the background of which really made me question a lot of the stuff that was coming out immediately after the September 11th attacks happened. A lot of these things that we were being told about what had been happening on that day, particularly to do with the complete failure of the US Air Force to react, it seems, apart from the Shanksville plane. This really made me question it, although I didn't really do a lot about it at the time and waited until some of the films had come out. So I worked in aviation for a while, then went on to work at the BBC doing really just researcher at Greater London Radio, which is a massive station, which I was working on documentaries and also on the Drive Time show, which was a pretty high-paced news programme which went out all over London. I suppose something like 10 million potential listeners. We had a massive audience, Greater London Radio, and we were dealing with news stories in London, which were a lot of which were international stories. Very few local radio stations had the kind of editorial content that we had in London. After the BBC experience, which was about nearly 4 years, working also in some other local radio stations and working my way up to as a reporter, then went on to get involved in environmental campaigning with something called The Land Is Ours, which was to do with land ownership and land rights, taking over pieces of land, squatting, and really showing the way land should be used rather than for things like another supermarket. And then really since then, I've got back into journalism as a freelancer and doing all sorts of other stuff as well. But mainly now, I suppose, concentrating on a weekly programme in Bristol, which is a 2-hour show on community radio, which is a politics show. And actually what we're trying to do with that show is do something that the BBC and the other stations in the city, in Bristol, are just simply not doing, which is to really give the politicians, you can all boo now if you want, the politicians a proper run out. Because when they go on to most of the local radio and television, they will get maybe on the TV, maybe 1.5 minutes at the most, on the radio maybe 3 minutes at the most to talk. So we give them a whole hour. And also we're running past them from time to time some of the big questions that you ask in these sorts of gatherings, which are the sorts of questions that a lot of the mainstream media, if not 99% of it, just simply avoids because it's too awkward to ask those questions. And I want to talk tonight largely about the media and about the way that what we get through our mainstream press in this country has changed so much over the last 30, 40 years and is a really distorted picture of the outside world. We like to think of the press as reflecting what's going on in society. That's what it's there to do. But it's becoming an institution which is literally telling us what to think. And I think this is one of the reasons we get so fed up. I think people can probably remember the film about, gosh, I can't even remember the name of it, but it's with that Guy Fawkes character. I'm sure someone will tell me now. Yes, where there's a little child screams at the television saying, "Oh, you don't expect us to believe that crap, do you?" And that's how I feel, I'm sure you do, a lot of the time now in this country.
Yeah.
It's the sort of thing we were spun as kids as a kind of Soviet-style press, where the press, the media, actually talks down to you and is trying to tell you what to think. Actually, as a nation, we're not like that. This is why people are actually leaving, particularly young people, the television news off and getting their news from other sources, like, you know, most importantly, obviously, the internet, which has been a real revolution over the last, 15 years or so. So I'm also doing selling documentaries online. So I've got a little sort of sideline business. Things like the Battle of the Beanfield, if people know about the way the travellers were attacked by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. And the other one we sell quite a lot of is something called the Battle of Trafalgar, which is a fantastic documentary made for Channel 4 about what actually really happened at the poll tax riots. What that documentary does is it shows you, contrasts the footage which was released that evening and during the day with actual footage from on the ground in Trafalgar Square. And what Mark Saunders, the producer of that, has done with it is he was there, he saw this riot unfolding, and he had the presence of mind to go around getting phone numbers for everyone he could see with a video camera, or back in those days, there were only a few video cameras around, but he got the phone numbers for everybody who was shooting film and video footage there, also stills photographers. And he painstakingly, over 3 or 4 months after the riots, put together a documentary that showed the lies that were being told by the mainstream press at the time to try and blame the riots on the demonstrators. He managed to show conclusively, and it's quite a shocking film, that it was the police that deliberately provoked the riot through driving a police van into the crowd. And it was the way that was spun that is so shocking about that film. So that's another thing I do. I'm also involved in the National Union of Journalists, which I joined about 10, 15 years ago. And as a union, I mean, I think we're still valid today. At the BBC, for example, we've had a whole series of disputes over probably the last 3 or 4 years, the latest of which is over compulsory redundancies. And let me just explain a little bit about, I mean, the first dispute was over a whole load of changes that the BBC wanted to make to contracts. And after 2 years of negotiations with fathers of chapel and mothers of chapel from right across the country, and our union officials negotiating with BBC management, eventually every single one of those demands by the BBC management was dropped. That's a strong union. And also, the most recent changes that the BBC are trying to do is obviously as part of the cuts, which largely is a government sop to Murdoch, saying that actually that the BBC is going to have to be pared down because it's unfair competition to Rupert Murdoch. I mean, none of us are the total fans of the BBC, but there are some really good people working in there and doing their best in a kind of Maginot line, you know, from behind the bunkers. And the changes recently, what they're trying to do is sack people. What's happened is the union has got together, this is journalists, our eyes and ears, the union has got together and spoken to everybody that's potentially going to be made redundant. Now what they've done is they've come up with a list of people who are prepared to take voluntary redundancy, and what they're saying is just swap the jobs around a little bit and nobody needs to be made compulsory redundant, but the BBC are having none of it. This is why the negotiation and the dispute is still going on right now. The reason for this is that the management are actually targeting individuals for their political views and for their courage. The journalists who are the most courageous are the ones that are being targeted with compulsory redundancy. So you can see that maybe what's going on behind the scenes and how important the trade union, the National Union of Journalists still is in Britain in actually allowing us to see what's really going on. It's a bit of a bunker mentality, and the battles that we see on the television in Afghanistan and Iraq are echoed within our newsrooms around the country as there are attempts to force courageous journalists out of their jobs onto the dole queue. So anyway, we come today, I suppose, really to talk about just about the press. I mean, this is what I wanted to talk to you about, some of the techniques used to manipulate the media. John Dewey is a philosopher from, I think he was American, Marty, you might remind me. his famous quote is, "Education is a system of imposed ignorance." One of his famous quotes. And I think this is really an important thing to remember. Because certainly the way we get taught our history in school in Britain is very, very selective. There's all sorts of things that they don't really want to tell us about. I mean, one of the large things is to do with the attacks on the Irish over the centuries, and the whole of Irish history. Really, you need to go somewhere else other than Britain to learn about it. It's not taught to us in British schools unless you want to maybe speak to an Irish person over here. And it's quite gobsmacking sometimes to realise that you thought you knew a bit about history and you don't. But in a way, journalism is a sort of running history lesson, because a lot of the stuff that we're getting at the moment, for example, to do with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and in the Middle East, contains a take on history, which is also slanted. So in a way, journalists are sort of teachers for people who've left school in a funny kind of fashion. I hope you're following, I hope I'm making sense, in fact. The other thing is, if you look at the entire nation or the entire world as one kind of body, I'm not really going too much into this whole Gaia thing, but the media is our nervous system. The media is our brain. And what better prize for a ruthless, greedy elite than to control that nervous system? They then would be able to, hopefully anyway, control the way we think, the way we react to things, and almost set triggers in our minds to react in certain ways to certain things. And I think that's what's going on with the way that the media is being controlled. In a way, the media is kind of like a nuclear weapon, in that, you've heard that expression, the pen is mightier than the sword. Those who like war and fighting and use this to get what they want realise that the modern, particularly broadcast media, is more powerful than they are, and they're scared to death that it will be telling the truth to people. So it's important for them to control the way that outlet of information and news is disseminated. Otherwise, we might rumble them, and they may not get what they want. Because the pen is mightier. Should we say the keyboard is mightier than the sword, or than the nuclear weapon, or whatever. So there's a tension there between people that want to use force and also people that want to actually understand what's going on in the world, so that maybe that force won't be used, or that somebody's bluff will be called. I think also, important, you can't talk about the media without talking about taboos, because the most important thing, is that there is a whole load of subjects which are just totally out of bounds for the press to discuss. I came across this myself, even simply talking about homelessness at Greater London Radio, saying that I've met some homeless people I wanted to do a piece on the radio about homelessness. I was told by an editor, well, no one's interested in that. It's not sexy enough. But hang on, homelessness is like one of the most important things that's going on in London. People having to sleep out in doorways. Isn't this something that actually affects more people? And also potentially lots of people who have got homes. So there are taboos, and I would say probably the most important two things which are misrepresented by the press, or not at all, are land and money. This is one of the reasons I got into this environmental campaigning, is just understanding how the land has been stolen from us over the centuries. Land is, whether you believe in God or not, land is a free gift to mankind. We all need it for somewhere to have a home. We all need it for recreation, to go for a walk, and we all need the resources the land gives us. Everybody needs that. And so in any sort of basic civilised society, you would think the land, everybody would have a right to it. In fact, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's absolutely clear after the Second World War, everyone has the right to shelter. Everyone. Now we're in a situation in this country where this government is talking about criminalising squatting and saying that it's impossible, even if a house has been empty for 10 years, that you're not allowed to go in there and actually get a roof over your head for the night. There's all sorts of really nasty stuff been coming out in the Daily Mail over the last few months about how these squatters are intentionally homeless. And actually what's happening is our financial system is failing us, and thousands of people every month are actually having their homes repossessed. What are they supposed to do? Our councils are unable to house people these days. They're not building any council houses. Just in Bristol, where I happen to know the figures, we've got over 20,000 people on the housing list waiting for somewhere to live. So squatting is an obvious, this is the market, isn't it? We've got loads of empty buildings. We've got loads of people that need them. Just put 2 and 2 together. And the land has been stolen over the centuries, basically through something called enclosure, which was privatisation of land. And this has been done by a parliament which only people who owned land were allowed to vote up until 150 years ago or so. Only people who own land. So this was a landowners' parliament kicking people off the land because they could make more profit out of sheep than they could out of rents from individuals on the land. So that's one thing you don't see really discussed very much in the mainstream media, because it's another piece of history which has been erased. The other thing is money, and the way money over the years, because of course once you've made people homeless by taking their land away, they are then totally reliant on a money system to feed their families, to feed themselves, and to live. And so the way that the money system is set up as a kind of private trap to get people is also not explained. The battle there's been over the years for the control of money on the private interests on the one hand, and from the treasuries and the government interests on this hand. So I mean, if people have ever come across Bill Still, I don't know if anyone here has seen any of his films. He did one called The Money Masters, which is very long and very detailed. And he did also one much more recently called The Secret of Oz. But Bill has really gone into, I think, explains it better than anyone else I've seen, that the way that the money system, they've first privatised the land, and then the elite have then privatised the money system. So we are totally reliant on them at this point, for the money, because we're landless. Now, okay, a bit about distortion in the press. There's a lot of law that we have to learn as journalists. Things like the Official Secrets Act. This often means that anything that might be something covered by the Official Secrets Act, journalists simply tiptoe around it. It's just too much trouble. If someone comes to them with a story, an ex-soldier, their immediate thoughts are, well, we can have a chat down the pub, but I'm sorry, I can't convert this into a story in the newspaper. It's going to be far too much hassle. Lawyers are expensive. Also, what your editor may well want is just for you to fill as much of the page space as possible. This is what happens nowadays. I mean, there are some notable exceptions, some principled national papers, for example, The Guardian printing some very brave stories to do with the phone hacking, and there are other examples. But generally speaking, the idea of a journalist nowadays is that you sit at a terminal, you don't leave the building, and you just simply fill up as much space as you possibly can in the shortest possible time. Now that does not include stories which rock the boat like an official secret story, where in preparation for the story the editor may get a call from the D-Notice Committee or somebody else, or from simply a Ministry of Defence lawyer saying, we noticed that you were doing this, we think it would be a very bad idea if you published it, or getting potentially even an injunction to stop. Now that means that journalist has been working maybe for 2 or 3 days on a story, and it actually isn't going to go anywhere. So these are some of the reasons why difficult legal stories aren't touched or tiptoed around. And if you talk to particularly local newspaper journalists nowadays, they will tell you a lot of their time is spent simply cutting and pasting press releases into a newspaper, which any child can do, a monkey could do. And then those pages are then just edited by someone does a page, layout, graphic designer, and a lot of their work is simply getting through as much material as possible that's easy and not controversial. So the other thing is there's something called the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom. Has anyone here ever heard of them? Yeah? Because they're a fantastic little organisation. They do, for I think £6 a year, they do a newsletter that comes out once every 2 months, and it gives you a whole insight into some of the things that are going on behind the scenes to do with media ownership. They have a chart, which they update every few years, of all the big media. There's 5 big media companies in the world, and how those have changed. You know, there's Bertelsmann is a massive media company, for example, that owned Channel 5 for quite a long time. One of the things that you don't often hear is that that Bertelsmann was the German firm that published Mein Kampf, for example. And they're now one of the 5 biggest media corporations in the world. And of course, they don't just publish books or own TV channels. They also own whole rafts of magazines in magazine publishing. They're doing radio, they're doing newspapers, and to a large extent, these organisations are growing in a quite frightening fashion because they're doing cross-fertilisation between these different media. They're plugging their books on the television, they're plugging their magazines on the TV or on the radio, and they're doing a lot of, really, which is just simply cross-marketing from one to another. Now that whole situation is getting worse and worse because the small guys cannot compete with these big 5. They're just being snapped up like little fishes being eaten by sharks. All the small people in the business are finding that there are immense pressures on them, either to sell up or have, have a hostile takeover. So this is the situation we're in with these the 5 big companies in US and Europe that run our press. And the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom is one of the only organisations in the country, if not in Europe, which is really keeping track of what's going on and giving them a hard time. So they're well worth knowing about. The other side of all this is advertising and how that affects what we see. I'll start off though with an exception to the rule, which is RTE. Do people know, did anyone here listen to RTE? The Irish broadcaster.
Yeah, I do.
RTE1 is actually really quite good. You know, if you want to listen to a slightly different angle on the world news, listen to RTE1. They're on long wave. I think it's 252 long wave. You can pick them up quite well here. For the east of Britain, you can't pick them up so well. But they have a very good system right from day one set up with advertising. That is to say, their advertising section is totally separate to the editorial. There's absolutely no way that the advertising companies that advertise on RTE can affect anything to do with the editorial process. That is to say, what's in the news. Because this is a serious problem in other parts of the media. The advertisers call the shots to a large extent when you're talking about a big company like, say, Mercedes, that has a contract with, say, The Guardian, spending something like 12, 13 million pounds a year on block ads that they will take throughout the year. The threat that that contract will be taken away can be a massive incentive on an editor to say, actually, I think we should back away from that story. Imagine, how would that sit, a BMW advert, for example, next to last week's story about BMW and forced labour, and how the Quant family that owned BMW used, I think it was 50,000 slave labourers in World War II, and that's how they made their money to buy BMWs. Would that sit next to a BMW advert nicely? So the advertising in RTE is one of the only places I've ever come across where they've made a formal, complete separation between advertising and the actual news content. Think also about programmes on the television like Grand Designs. Grand Designs, we might like to watch it. It's sort of old-fashioned buildings. I take it most people have seen this show where people kind of go and build a new building, their dream home. Grand Designs is actually aimed at a very high-end market for advertisers. This is the kind of thing the advertisers love because the people that will, never mind about the rest of us, but this programme appeals to the people who have a fantastic amount of disposable income in our society generally. And those are the people that the advertisers want to reach. So Grand Designs, as it rolls out on More 4, can be guaranteed to pull in just the right kind of advertising, or at least a lot of a lot of money for the advertising. But actually, a lot of it is aspirational for you and me, probably. I'm never going to buy a massive mansion and do it. It's all just looking, well, maybe one day I could be like this. I was chatting to Martin about this earlier on. This is like Dallas. It's like all aspirational. Let's look at where things could be maybe one day. And it's actually I think quite horrible. Every time I see Grand Designs, I find there's something sick about this. What you're doing is, you're doing a great show about something which most people will never ever be able to afford to do. They can just wish maybe do the lottery, you know. And I find that sort of, the way that the content is decided in media boardrooms based around, we want to have something, the advertisers will want to have a TV advert on. I find that horrible, you know. We should be deciding on content based on what affects people. What is going to affect people in the years to come? What actually touches people's lives in a big way? That's how we should decide. And if you go to journalism college, that's what they tell you. You know, you look at a news bulletin, and that news bulletin should have at the top of it the story which affects people the most. The most people, the most. And down a news bulletin, it should be stories that affect people less and less, maybe. And maybe some silly story at the end. That's the sort of tradition, isn't it? You have some kind of bogus silly story at the end about a dog or whatever. And this is just as a sideline. I used to work on a phone-in down at Radio Solent in Southampton. I did that for about a year. And it was just incredible to see what would actually elicit the most phone calls. And that was silly stories like that about pets. And you get thousands of phone calls. And yet, when I was working down there, it was when it was the very first day of the First Gulf War in 1991, the invasion of Kuwait. And Portsmouth's very close to us. It's a military town. We decided we were going to do a discussion in the morning on the phone-in, all about the war. And the producer I worked with was a fantastic woman. She had printed typed out a script for the presenter, who was the girl that presented The South Today, which was the BBC's TV thing in the evening. She was on our radio station in the morning doing a phone discussion, so everyone kind of knew who she was. And she read out this thing saying, oh, people phone in, could people just phone in, tell us what you think about this war, is it the right thing to do, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, as she read this, what we always did was we would play a bit of music. She'd read out the script, introducing the topic for people to phone in about. And let's just start with a little bit of music. And at that point, the music went on, you see the lights all starting to light up as people started to phone in, and we filtered through the calls. Anyone, you know, you always get one person who phoned in every week, every morning, the same kind of, and just tell them to go away or politely. But that morning, nothing happened, right? I was sitting there, and I turned to the producer, I said, what the hell's going on? Are they someone jamming our phone lines or what? And she looked at me and she said, well, actually, no, we just haven't told them what to think yet. She didn't say it in a nasty way. She was saying in an ironic, you know, look, actually maybe, you know, because it's, you know, it's quite a big topic. We're going to war this morning. And what she did is she got a typewriter. It was the days before even Amstrad computers. She got a typewriter, typed this script out really quickly. I ran it through into the presenter just as the music was finishing. She read this script, which was saying things like, have you got someone who's in the forces now? Are you worried about them? Have you ever been to that part of the world? Tell us if you've ever been to the Middle East. You know, what do you think? And she wanted a whole load of sort of triggers saying what you might think. And as the presenter was reading the script out, I was just gobsmacked as the phone line started lighting up. Bop, 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 bop. And we had a big audience there, a whole of Southampton and Portsmouth and all the surrounding areas we were covering. So you can see that there is this kind of, especially with things that are far away. If it's in your own backyard, we know what to think about it. But so much of what we see in here today, particularly in the mass media, is something we never have any direct experience of. We're really trusting the press. And this is why it's so important that our press tells the truth about what's going on in other parts of the world. Another example of that is Michael Meacher in The Guardian, towards the, you know, this is about a couple of years after the whole 9/11 business, did an article saying, this war on terror is bogus, in The Guardian. Check it, it's on the website still, just about. This war on terror is bogus. Now, I knew a guy in London who worked for the Guardian advertising department, and he told me that they had several big institutions phone in that same day that article came out to say to the Guardian, we're pulling our advertising. And there was nearly £1 million worth of advertising was pulled that same day that article went into the Guardian. So you can see we've got a fundamental flaw in our media. It's actually the people with the money call the shots about content. Now, there's a certain amount of room for manoeuvre, you know, and there certainly has been during the phone hacking business. But there's a real problem in the things which are really controversial, which hit a nerve amongst the international elite. You may well find that your paper will go under if you print